Okay, we'll crack into it. I'll start moving to it. Yeah, welcome to everybody as you're starting to join our NZRSB webinar looking at the beef value chain sustainability. So we've got three speakers today. I'm going to discuss what is the beef value chain, what are some of the risks and opportunities, and what does it mean to you. Well, our three speakers are Nick Jolly, Merri King, and Belinda Freeman. And as each one comes up, I will introduce them a little bit more as we move along. We're just waiting as a few more people are joining. This is also being recorded. You're aware of that. And then throughout the presentation, if you have any questions, just please use the Q&A box down the bottom and enter them in at any time throughout the presentations, and then we will cover them off at the end, those questions and answers. We're under a little bit of time pressure. Well, not really time pressure. We have sort of 45 minutes and a fair bit to get through, so I will endeavour to try and keep things moving as much as I can. Still a few people joining. We'll just wait a couple of minutes. Okay, I think we might crack into it. So first up, we have Nick Jolly. So Nick Jolly is the Senior Trade Policy Advisor for the Environment for Beef and Lamb New Zealand. Tonight, Nick's going to provide an update and an overview of what's happening in the world in regards to trade and sustainability, what industry and government are doing, and also what it means for New Zealand beef producers. Nicholas Jolly is originally from a sheep and beef farm in Central Otago. As the Senior Trade Policy Advisor for the Environment, Nick works on protecting current market access and unlocking the opportunities for New Zealand sheep and beef exports. Very passionate about trade and has recently completed a Master of International Trade at Victoria and Wellington. Nick also works on international environmental matters such as climate change and biodiversity, and leads Beef and Lamb New Zealand's engagement with a range of and also the GRSB, which is the Global Roundtable. He's uniquely positioned to link industry activities worldwide and is determined to grow opportunities across the supply chain for sustainable beef in New Zealand. So welcome, Nick, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks. Slide. Awesome. Well, thanks for the introduction, Richard. We thought it was worth just explaining what we mean when we talk about the value chain versus the supply chain, which is probably the more common terminology that you're aware of. So the value chain refers to the inputs of a product that add value. And as it's consumers that are paying for the product, the chain begins there. During production of the product, there are many activities that add value that are not necessarily involved in actually producing the product itself. New Zealand Roundtable for Sustainable Beef uses the value chain approach as it is more inclusive and recognises the importance of these associated activities, such as research, innovation, and verification, as well as the farmers, processors, retailers that handle the product and get it to the consumer. The supply chain is outlined below and focuses more narrowly on the product, beginning first at the farmer and then moving through the supply chain to the customer. Because it doesn't include these other associated organisations and inputs, we use the value chain, which we feel is a bit more inclusive and recognises the broad membership base that the New Zealand Roundtable for Sustainable Beef has. So what are we talking about today? We're talking about trade policy and the role of beef and lamb, and a little bit about the Meat Industry Association, which is our counterpart organisation representing the processors. So trade policy is done predominantly at a government level, and what we're talking about today, or what I'm talking about today, is the impact of the government's decisions on trade, rather than necessarily what businesses are asking for. We'll then talk a bit about trade and sustainability, about current challenges facing trade and sustainability, and then what the future looks like for sustainable beef trade. So Beef and Lamb and the Meat Industry Association work closely with government on trade policy such as free trade agreements and ongoing market access issues. Roughly, there are two types of barriers. There are tariffs and non-tariff barriers. Tariffs are what most people think of when they think of trade. They're a tax on imports, and they're reduced through free trade agreements or FTAs. Non-tariff barriers are trickier and come in many forms. They also impact trade by making it more challenging to export to a particular market. Examples of non-tariff barriers could be prescriptive labeling requirements or sustainability requirements, import checks, or inconsistent technical requirements that add significant cost and complexity onto exporters. In 2022, New Zealand exported just under $12 billion worth of red meat products. We did a study last year and we estimated that tariffs cost the red meat sector around $200 million a year, whereas non-tariff barriers cost the sector around 1.5 billion. So you can sort of see the difference between the two. Tariffs have reduced progressively due to previously negotiated FTAs and will continue to do so. For example, the 2015 New Zealand-South Korea Free Trade Agreement, tariffs on beef started at 40%, but will reduce to 0% in 2029. They're currently at 13.3%. So you can sort of see how previous agreements that we've done will continue to deliver those benefits over time. It should be noted as well that a free trade agreement doesn't necessarily mean free trade. They should be seen as an improvement on the status quo, as tariffs, quotas, and non-tariff barriers can remain. Beef and Lamb and the Meat Industry Association's goal is to reduce trade barriers, both tariff and non-tariff, as much as possible, and provide exporters with the best possible market access. It's then up to the exporters to decide which markets they want to export to based on their own commercial strategies. From the map there, you can see that we have a very good coverage of free trade agreements, mostly with our export partners and main exporting countries. And while there are still markets we're seeking new free trade agreements with, such as in the Middle East, with India or the United States, focus has shifted to addressing those non-tariff barriers and protecting the market access that we have. While Beef and Lamb and the Meat Industry Association work together on trade, we also focus on our own areas. For the Meat Industry Association, this is on issues around meat processing, such as food safety, while Beef and Lamb focuses on issues behind the farm gate. There's been increasing interest by our trading partners on sustainability and animal welfare. And these countries want to know what happens on New Zealand farms and that we're producing beef in a way that aligns with their ethical and sustainable expectations. This was a key issue in the recent UK and European Union free trade agreements, and both of those FTAs have specific chapters on sustainability and animal welfare. Previous FTAs have included sustainability, but not quite to the same extent. Demonstrating that our beef production is sustainable and our animals are looked after can provide for additional market access, and it's a key part of our advocacy when pushing back against protectionist sentiment. However, this alone does not guarantee good outcomes. For example, the EU FTA, New Zealand received minimal improvements in market access for beef, which was only equivalent to around 2% of our beef production. On the other side of the coin, sustainability can be used by these export partners for protectionist measures by adding unnecessary and difficult to comply with import requirements that don't understand New Zealand's pastoral systems. A key part of our advocacy is demonstrating how our different regulatory and farming systems provide equivalent outcomes. We're seeing an increase of non-tariff barriers relating to sustainability and animal welfare. With non-tariff barriers, it's really like a game of whack-a-mole. once you address one, another one sort of seems to pop up. These sustainability-linked non-tariff barriers have the potential to negatively impact our trade, even though New Zealand beef is produced in a way that aligns with consumer expectations of sustainability and animal welfare. A key issue really is that these NTBs or non-tariff barriers are not always designed with New Zealand farm systems in mind. They can therefore impose significant compliance costs on our beef exporters, or in the worst case, be so unworkable that we lose access to certain markets. A current example of this at the moment is the European Union's deforestation-free supply chains, which is aimed at commodities such as palm oil, soy, cattle products, and timber, where there is a risk that their production could contribute to deforestation. This regulation will require geolocation coordinates of every property that a beef animal has been raised on. And while this regulation is predominantly aimed at South American beef production, and even though New Zealand does not have an issue with deforestation, we still have to comply with it. Barriers like this would impose huge costs on New Zealand farmers and exporters if we were to build a new system to comply with this. So we're looking at what we've already got in place. Beef and Lamb's role, along with MIA, is to monitor the development of these regulations and provide information that demonstrates that New Zealand farmers are looking after the environment to those that are developing the regulation. We also work closely with the New Zealand and European governments to ensure that our voice is heard and that any new regulations provide a pathway for New Zealand exports. Apologies, haven't been clicking through. Where to from here? New Zealand's well placed to provide ethically and sustainably produced beef into our international markets. Our strong regulations, as well as the work that farmers have done to improve biodiversity, reduce emissions, and ensure animals are looked after, means that we're world leading. We must ensure that the market access that we've fought for so hard for is not impacted by regulations that don't understand our farming systems. To do this, we must continue to demonstrate that we're world leading and that our government must be ready to use the free trade agreements that we've negotiated to secure this access and ensure that trade can continue. We support trade and sustainability initiatives, but these must not be used for protectionist purposes. There are already a lot of commercial requirements that Belinda and Merri will talk about that are driving sustainability, and in most cases, these go much further than what governments require. Government regulation can heavily restrict trade while not achieving the desired outcome, as the regulation can be too blunt. When developing these regulations, consultation is needed with affected countries, such as New Zealand, to ensure that the regulation achieves its purpose without unduly restricting trade. Thanks, and as Richard said before, any questions can go in the Q&A section, and I'll be happy to answer them at the end.
Awesome, thanks, Nick. Brilliant, being on time, so that's awesome. Just quick for people that have joined and missed the intros. I'm Richard Scholefield, so moderating tonight, and I'm the chair of. I'm a farmer producer and also the chair of NZRSB. And also just thanks, Nick. Any questions as throughout the presentations, just whack them in the Q&A box and we'll answer them at the end. So our second presentation is from Merri King. So Merri is the Sustainable Sourcing Manager for McDonald's Australia Limited. Merri's going to provide us with a retailer's view of what consumers are demanding and share what they are doing in their business to match source products with consumer interests. Meredith King is the Sustainable Sourcing Manager for McDonald's in Australia and in Australasia, in fact. She began her career with Cargill Australia, and as it became clear that the impact of global warming was going to be disastrous for agriculture, she turned her focus to sustainable agricultural farming practices. Merri is excited about the opportunities that the NZRSB group presents for the industry in New Zealand, particularly as McDonald's moves towards being carbon neutral by 2030. You may also find Merri hiking one of the many trails across Australia and New Zealand. So welcome, Merri, and I'll leave it up to you.
Thanks, Richard, and thanks everyone for having me here to chat to you tonight about what's happening from a retailer's perspective as we look towards reducing our Scope 3 emissions. But importantly, what does that mean for you as a producer? How does that look as a company, a big global company like McDonald's is looking at its Scope 3 impact and we're reducing our emissions? What does that look like for you? So McDonald's has entered the race to get to net zero. We're committed to the Paris Climate Agreement to keep global warming to under 1.5 degrees. As a leading global brand, we've embraced that opportunity, and it's really important that we commit to that and continue on that path towards trying to keep our global warming to 1.5 degrees. When we talk about consumers and customers, for a company like McDonald's, one of our largest consumers and most important markets is the export market, particularly for a region like Australia and New Zealand. We've, from an Australian perspective, and I'll just preface this by apologising if it has too much of an Australian slant to it, but I think that it will provide you with a perspective of a global brand. But certainly Australian beef is exported and is currently in roughly around 65% of McDonald's restaurants globally. So it's really important that we are able to provide traceability and a clear pathway forward to what we're doing to reducing our own Scope 3 emissions. But what does that look like? And as I said, how does that play out for someone who's out there producing beef? So this is McDonald's emissions profile, our Scope 3 emissions profile. As you can see, this is the global profile, by the way, but it correlates to exactly the same percentages at a local level across Australia and New Zealand. So beef outstrips anything else that we do, whether it's transport, our restaurants, our energy use. The Scope 3 emissions from beef outstrips any other aspect of our business. A really significant part of that beef is deforestation and land use change. So we're really making inroads into being able to source beef that is deep-free, basically coming off non-deforested land. And Nick prefaced this before, and clearly an important aspect of that is the EU laws that are coming into play. We've known about them for a while, and they'll be enforceable from the end of the year. And that is essentially the EU is looking to access beef that is coming off 100% deep-free land. So that is a really big part of what we are doing to reduce our Scope 3 emissions, and that'll become clear in a couple of little slides about how that actually comes together. So just let me move on to the next slide. So in just towards the end of last year, we had our SBTi targets, science-based targets validated for 2030. So the most important part for you watching this is on the right-hand side of the screen, I beg your pardon, where we are looking at 16% absolute reduction in farm emissions across beef, which includes dairy beef and chicken. That is a global target. At a local target, and a local being Australia and New Zealand, we're looking at that correlates to being a 7% reduction, absolute reduction. So that as we are looking at business growth, we have to be reducing our Scope 3 emissions based off a 2018 baseline. So it's a big target. It's a huge target, actually, and there's a lot of work to be done. It's 2024, so there's a huge amount of work to be done before we get to 2023, so 2030, I beg your pardon. So that's just a graph of what it looks like to accelerate our goals. So as we are looking at business growth models, what does that look like to be able to continually be reducing our Scope 3 emissions? So there's a couple of different ways that we can do that. Globally, we've committed to, there's two levers that we can pull. One is our carbon reduction project, so on the left-hand side of the screen. What is it going to take to actually understand what our Scope 3 emissions profile looks like, and what can we do to actually reduce that greenhouse gas footprint? So that, generally speaking, is going to probably involve some of the larger investment opportunities that we're looking at. So herd efficiencies, methane reduction, inputs into feed, different genetic projects that we're looking at in conjunction with research organisations. And that is probably where the big money will need to be invested. And then on the right-hand side of the screen is regenerative agricultural practices. So what can we actually do to look at creating ways of taking carbon out of the atmosphere, as opposed to our broader profile, our own footprint. The regenerative agricultural practices will help in creating an environment for taking carbon out of the atmosphere. So the regenerative agricultural priorities is probably something that we're going to be looking at, because, and I'm actually really loath to use this term, but it's probably the best way of describing it. Some regen agricultural opportunities actually provide some of the low-hanging fruit. So from our aspect, it's like, how do we improve the soil biodiversity, that natural capital that will really impact how we can reduce that carbon footprint. There is currently in New Zealand, we're working with a group over on it'll be your East Coast in Napier, with the Ag Research New Zealand group, which is basically a regenerative agricultural project that is looking at things like nitrogen levels, animal nutrition, and whether some of these outcomes can be linked to environmental verification programs. I'm very conscious that obviously the environmental profile in New Zealand is quite different to Australia's profile. Over here we've got the oldest soils on Earth, and you've got quite a very new country. So it is different, but those principles of regenerative agriculture can be applied broadly across all aspects of the agricultural supply chain. And that's something that we're looking to invest in. And via the New Zealand Roundtable, we are also looking at those opportunities for New Zealand. It's how can we partner with different organisations, different farms, different groups, to be able to bring some of those practices into play. And it may very well be research opportunities is probably where we're going to be looking at. So just probably the final slide that I've got is just a bit of more of a visual around what's happening between now and 2030. A line that I often use, and it really focuses my mind in terms of the job that's ahead, is we have actually about 6 growing seasons till we get to 2030. That's not a lot of time to be able to make an impact in reducing our Scope 3 emissions. So there is a big job at hand for global organisations like McDonald's, it could be a Mars, it can be a Unilever, some of these big, large organisations, to be able to partner at a local level with different organisations like the New Zealand Roundtable to look for opportunities to be able to bring down our own Scope 3 emissions profile. Because if we don't, we're going to lose access to some of those important export markets. For countries like Australia, New Zealand, if we haven't got viable trading options, I was going to use a proverbial term about it being up the creek, but it is something that we need to be very, very mindful of as we head rapidly towards 2030 and what other countries are doing. They are working at pace as well to be able to solve this problem. And for exporting nations like Australia and New Zealand, it's becoming critical that we find answers to our own Scope 3 profile. So that's probably it from my perspective. Thanks for the opportunity. I'm really, we'll take any questions towards the end, as Richard said. Thank you.
No, great. Thanks, Merri. And yeah, just another reminder, that's the Q&A box for questions. Any questions for Merri? We'll get to those. So we're tracking along really well with time. So just going to introduce Belinda Freeman. So Belinda Freeman is the Global Insights Manager for Scholefield Farms. So tonight, Belinda's going to link the global position to the New Zealand farmer and the New Zealand farming system by way of consumer insights. So Belinda Freeman is passionate about the collection and use of connected, actionable insights to inform strategy, activity, and measure performance, and is loving applying that at Scholefield Farms. Her commercial know-how includes experience with media sales, retail marketing, and executive level research management, commercial and operational. She has been a research and insight specialist for over 20 years, developing and implementing research solutions for global brands with key global agencies around the world and back here in New Zealand. Most recent experience has been within New Zealand retail, including foodstuffs, consumer shopper insights, including category management, and farmer insights. So, yeah, welcome, Belinda.
You can't, no, sorry. Oh, what's the first rule of thumb? Get off mute. Hello, everybody. I probably should have edited down that introduction a little bit. It did, goodness gracious me. Well, first of all, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to come and actually represent the consumer in this webinar tonight. I joined, as Richard said, Silver Fern Farms just under 2 years ago. Actually, I was charged with, please can you set up a framework for attaining and using consumer insights that are really going to underpin and support our plate to pasture strategy. And I have been so excited to be able to do that, because what we needed was to have a really strong, wide, broad, comprehensive understanding of the consumer's relationship with the product that we essentially trade, which is premium red meat around the world. So we've done that, and actually one of the first things that I did do, which underpins a lot of the insights that we have, that I will share some of those snippets tonight, but has actually also given us a wonderful starting point with which we then go deeper into some of the specific aspects of people's consuming meat in home and out of home, as well as their buying meat. And for the purpose of this presentation tonight, specifically how ethical and sustainable meat shows up, how important is it, and what are the aspects of sustainability that the consumers are currently telling us they're concerned about. I'll be covering a few of those. So first of all, I just wanted to sort of set the scene a little bit, which is actually about just over a year ago, we started doing the research, the consumer research, in more than 9 countries. And because we needed to get a proper quantitative understanding, we actually talked to over 9,000 people in 9 countries, which we realized following was actually representing almost 2 billion consumers. And we've established what we are calling our premium red meat benchmarking study, which is, as I said, the relationship that they have with eating and buying red meat, and particularly premium red meat, because that's where New Zealand plays so beautifully and where Silver Fern Farms is focused. These were the 9 countries. Now, in case any of you were at the Silver Fern Farms conference mid last year, you might notice some of these slides as familiar. I did present this this deck to our farmers, and it went down very, very well. So you're not newbies, but we surveyed the globe in our core markets, which were not unlike those that Nick spoke to earlier. And actually, similarly, we know that these are big meat eating areas, but particularly the US, UK, Germany. We went to the Middle East, Saudi, UAE. We went across to China, South Korea, Japan, and then to New Zealand. Sorry, Merri, no Australia. And the way that I wanted to really impart some of the very key insights to the farmers was actually by way of a couple of things. I could have stood up and done, 105 charts, which would have bored them all to death. But actually what I did was I listened to what some of the things were being said around consumers' relationship with premium red meat just within our own organisation. And I was a little bit horrified, actually, at some of the sort of anecdote and views that some of our actually exec had about the role that red meat plays in people's daily eating, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So what I did is I created these myth busters, because I thought, you know what, I'm going to kill those myths right now, and I'm going to kill them through wonderful data. So the myth busting started, and one of the first things, of course, was that we were being told in the business potentially people aren't eating red meat anymore. And I was like, you know what? That's just not true. So in our research, we found that actually across all of those 9 markets, that around 95% of people were eating red meat and regularly. This was ever eating, and then we have the slightly lower figures, but still those people who are eating it weekly, and we know exactly how often people are eating. What you can see though is that actually some countries are a little lower and some countries are a little higher, which is impacting that the average, but it's still significantly high. So actually what we did was we asked everybody that said they didn't eat beef or lamb or venison, we asked them why, which meats. So we've got a whole bunch of reasons as to why people don't eat those specific things. But essentially, we only found 212 people who said they didn't eat any of those red meats. And actually, largely, around 2/3 of those people, it was because of animal welfare. Farming sustainability was the next reason. And then actually things like health and taste. Only 57 out of the 212 actually identified the carbon footprint as something that they were concerned about specifically. Now, when we go to each market, we know that the impact of local meat starts to rise a little bit, but actually it's still essentially very important part of people's protein intake, and that they really aren't stopping eating meat. So then we said, well, actually, okay, so old people all eat meat, that's fine. What about young people? They don't eat meat. And here was the wonderful, I really found this piece absolutely fascinating. Sorry, I've gone. Which was when we looked at the respondents by age across those 9 markets, and we looked at the young people 18 to 24, 25 to 34. Actually, you could see that of those, whilst there were around 65% of all people were eating any red meat weekly, young people are more likely to be eating it, specifically those 25 to 34, who 71% said they eat red meat at least once a week. So then we looked at, actually, let's look at that in the context of the other proteins, animal proteins that people eat on a regular basis, because of course, nobody just exclusively eats one type of protein at all. So you can see at the top, we've got eggs and chicken, but as you start to go across those other age groups, Generation Z and millennials, typically both known as the young people, versus Gen X and boomers, actually, what a wonderful story, because the younger people are more likely to be eating red meat than those older demographics, which is great. So then we were sort of looking at that subsidiary of, well, they're all eating plant-based as well. So that's a threat. Actually, you can see that younger people are eating plant-based, but they're not eating it instead of necessarily. It's this wonderful repertoire of different proteins. And actually what you can see is older people are slightly more likely to be eating fish. But you can see in these younger groups, again, that they've got beef on the repertoire, they've got lamb very much, and even venison. So those wonderful other meats too, alongside beef. So then the next thing was, well, you know what? People don't care about the quality of the meat they eat. It's too expensive or whatever. They just aren't interested in engage. They just buy the cheapest thing. Well, do you know what? They don't. So actually what we asked specifically was around their premium red meat purchasing. And then we asked them about, when you buy meat, how important or how often do you try to include sustainable and ethically produced meat? And in fact, we were really shocked at the high incidence of people across those different countries, again, saying on average, 54% do try to include sustainable and ethical either all of the time or occasionally. They were honest. Again, some countries more than others. You can see here that Germany and China, it's very important. Similarly, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, they're the countries more likely to say they do it all the time. And then honestly, some of the other countries like Korea saying, actually, I do it occasionally. And similarly, New Zealand, the US and the UK, who all have a similar profile, actually saying, yep, I do try to do that, probably a little bit more occasionally. But again, ethical and sustainable meat is very important. What was wonderful, though, was when we looked at it again across those age groups. And I think to your point, Merri, that you said about younger people, is again, you can see here that they were actually more likely to say that they do try to include ethical and sustainable produced meat all of the time. So 23%, 28%, 21 and 20, which is great news. The other thing that we did notice as an aside is that this particularly resonates, especially alongside premium red meat eating, with with consumers who have children in their household. So again, where you think that oftentimes they can be stretched and strapped and the cost of living crisis is having a terrible impact, actually what we found was the opposite. People with children in the home are actually a lot more engaged and caring about the quality of red meat that they buy. So there's a strong correlation there. And there again, what I said just before is in terms of when they say how important is best quality red meat. Again, you've got 78% across all who say it's important, or either very or somewhat important. We do have some people in markets that say, no, it's not important, and that can be for lots of different reasons. When we do this type of study, what we hate is when all countries come back with similar responses, because we go, might not have hit it on the head in terms of what we wanted. So you're always very happy when you get a little outlier. And in this case, it's Japan. Japan is our outlier, the outlier being that they answered slightly differently to everybody else. So they were less likely to say best quality is important, a little bit more likely to say it wasn't. And the reason for that is because they just assume it's all good quality. They just have great quality meat. Interestingly, so does New Zealand. New Zealand, it's intrinsic. We know that our meat is great quality, but actually people still called it out as being as good quality being important. And then lastly, what we asked again was some questions. We did ask some specific questions around cost of living and finances, which I haven't shared tonight because it was just adding a little bit more to the time to the deck. But what we did ask was, what are the things that are keeping you up at night? What's the stuff that's really important for you around all of these big issues in the world? And actually, we were sort of saying that because of the cost of living crisis, because of inflation, because people are strapped, that the concern for climate change has lessened. Well, indeed, what we found was the concern for climate change is still actually really important. Sorry, my finger's shaking. And that across those markets, again, 36% of people identified a generic climate change as one of their major concerns. You can see again the countries where they're more concerned than the average, and the countries where they're less concerned of the average, primarily China, Japan, South Korea. But again, you've got UK, Germany, New Zealand, and other countries all being concerned about generic climate change. So then we asked specifically about some of the factors, and remembering that these are consumers, they probably don't understand some of the ways that we describe sustainable farming, biodiversity, and all this type of thing. So we put it in language that our consumers could understand and that would be common potentially across all 9 markets. And we did ask again about the cost of living inflation. There's your generic climate change, obviously war and pandemics, but we've got national disasters, food shortages, water pollution, and terrorism being the top 10 concerns from a long list. And you can see in here, New Zealand and UK very concerned about the cost of living. And then for each of these other measures, the country that is most concerned about each of those things. And where that really plays out, though, is when we do start to look at it in relation to farming, in relation to the consumer's understanding of the things that are impacting farming, remembering they're looking for ethical and sustainable meat. And actually what we found was the generic climate change here, 36 people would have answered. But actually, when they then answered any of the other climate related or specific concerns, such as air pollution, water pollution, you've got waste, litter and landfill, carbon emissions, rising sea levels, greenhouse gases, reliance on fossil fuels, and even crop devastation. For those people who answered one or more of those things, when you aggregate it, that comes to 67%. So of that global population, people, the consumer who we spoke to, there's almost 2 billion people, 67% of them are actually concerned about climate change and some of the specifics that is playing out, and that they also want ethical and sustainable premium red meat. And so when I presented this to our farmers, I said, you know, this is giving you a right to play. This is beautifully positioning a wonderful New Zealand product on the global stage. Thank you. Hope I haven't gone over.
You went over a little bit, Belinda, but that was awesome.
I'm
Thank you very
sorry.
much for
Thank you
that.
so much.
Yeah, no, brilliant. Okay, so we're just going to rock into some questions. We are I do have some questions here. So I've got a question for Nick. What science is currently missing to justify our claims of sustainable and ethical agricultural practices for beef?
Going back to my slideshow and presentation and what I was talking about with the non-tariff barriers side of things, I think there's probably two aspects of the question, so I'll answer them first. The first bit is, what science do we need to show foreign governments that our production is sustainable and ethically produced in a way that aligns with what they're looking for? I think we probably have all of that data. And if you look at things that we've done around, studies that Beef and Lamb and others have produced around the life cycle analysis of our products, other ones looking at how our farmers farm, I think we probably have that. The question really is, do those countries care enough about New Zealand's trade, or are they trying to sort of protect their own producers by using these environmental non-tariff barriers as as a trade barrier? The other side of it is, if we're looking at what our customers or consumers, and when I say customers, I sort of mean the McDonald's, the supermarkets, that side of thing, rather than necessarily the people. The data that we have around wider studies, going back to the life cycle analysis that looked at the carbon footprint of our sheep meat and beef, and then also our farm assurance programs that verify the animal welfare and the sustainability actions taken by our farmers. I think that has put us in a really good place with being able to deliver to those customers product that aligns with what they're looking for. So I don't think we're missing science there. I think we can always do more, but what we've got at the moment has put New Zealand farmers in a really good place.
Awesome, great. Thanks, Nick. Question for Merri. What kind of standards are available today regarding sustainability? So for regen, ag, and other systems.
Okay, so I think that I'm off mute, yeah. So I think that question refers to carbon accounting methodologies. So from a regen ag perspective, there is different providers out there who are au with the principles of regenerative agriculture, soil health, biodiversity, those key aspects of regenerative agriculture. So it's a case of then looking at your own carbon accounting methodologies. So there are numerous apps and whatnot that are out there, and I think it's then getting behind the apps to make sure that they have really good quality methodologies behind them that have been approved, science-based approvals behind them. So what you'll be doing is you'll be inputting into, I apologise if I'm speaking to the converted here, but people understand what I'm talking about. But you'll be inputting all of the different processes on your property, what you're doing, and then in turn, then you'll get an understanding of your own Scope 3 emissions, and you'll look to ways of how to be able to reduce that. One of which might be improving the soil quality on your farm. So you'll then start to put that into your carbon accounting methodology, and you'll be able to see your Scope 3 emissions going down. So that, when we talk about ways that could, proper approval methodologies, it is actually using a certain type of carbon accounting methodology. And as I said, there are many providers out there that have been themselves certified, whether it's with quality government organisations. So from an Australian perspective, McDonald's have been using a company called Ruminati. I know they're coming over to New Zealand to start. I've invited them over for the New Zealand Roundtable, but they have been using, they have a really simple to use app, but it has been absolutely approved by the highest science-based organisations in Australia, plus the government as well, to be able to say, yeah, okay, the number that you're looking at on that particular calculator is going to be approved, and you will be able to take that to be able to, speak to your banks, whoever it is, when you're talking about your own Scope 3 emissions profile. So that part of it, I think, is really key. I would be, unless Nick or Belinda, you've got a different opinion on what's happening in New Zealand, but as far as understanding what is something that you can use and that you can approve, it actually comes down to those carbon accounting methodologies and looking behind that and making sure that they have been approved and that they have the right verifications behind them before you go start trying to understand your own scope emissions profile with anyone else that's out there. And it is, I have to say, it is quite frankly the Wild West out there with a lot of these carbon accounting methodologies. There's apps everywhere. Anyone can create an app and sell it. So that side of it's really important to be able to be looking at something and say, okay, so who approved this? What organisation is there out there that said, yeah, this is actually something that is worthwhile using and is based in science?
Awesome, thanks, Merri. We've probably got time for two more questions. So just, Belinda, there's a question here. How did you capture the consumer responses and when did you do that?
Oh, yeah. So it was a quantitative survey for people who understand what that is. We asked them via various methods and use proper research agencies to do that. And it was about this time last year. So we didn't do all 9 countries at exactly the same time. It was a process over about 3 months. So yeah, Q1 and 2 last year. And we're in field right now with the latest updates. So we'll have new data, particularly around some of those key metrics to keep our eye on them, because we know that there's been quite a big impact on consumers in terms of the wars and various things that are happening at the moment. So we're definitely tracking that.
Awesome. Hey, look, I do apologise. We are running a little bit over time, but there is one really good question there, which I think I will open to the panel to discuss or answer. So with the majority of demand for Scope 3 emission reductions coming from large corporate purchasers of manufacturing beef, should we not be focusing on scaling up the dairy beef industry with the reduced emission profiles of these animals with the dairy genetics suited to supply the lean beef they're looking for? So probably, you can all answer it if you like, but probably Nick and then maybe Merri would be interesting to comment on that as well.
Yeah, awesome question. And the results of our life cycle analysis that we released last year found that New Zealand dairy beef or beef from dairy origins has the lowest carbon footprint of any beef produced worldwide. So I think there's 2 things there really. Targets that these large businesses are putting in place are emissions intensity targets. So they're looking at reducing their emissions per intensity of product. And then you've got government targets around gross emissions. So while we could increase production and lower our emissions intensity per kilo of product, we would then go over our gross, so our total emissions. So there's challenges there with different targets pulling farmers in different directions. The other challenge, of course, is that those animals need to eat grass and they are competing with the dairy industry. And until you sort of see quite a significant change in milk and meat price, you'll have higher incomes available for dairy farming versus beef farming. So there's always going to be that competition, which is why farmers haven't necessarily changed towards that. And my final point on that, because I know we're running out of time, is that New Zealand producing really low emissions intensity beef at the moment is a massive opportunity, I believe, in the short term, because the easiest thing these large international companies can do to reduce their emissions is buy New Zealand beef. Where it potentially is a risk in the long term is because we have pastoral farming systems and it's much trickier to feed our animals some of these new feed additives that would reduce emissions. Potentially some of our competitors that do a lot of feedlotting in the long term could reduce their emissions quite quickly, whereas we would struggle to do so. So yeah, opportunity in the short term, but potentially quite a challenge in the long term. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Yeah, Merri, did you want to have a quick comment? Just, a final comment on that at all?
No, look, I'd probably just echo Nick's comments because you guys are the experts over there. A lot of the work that McDonald's has done to date has actually been in animal welfare from a dairy perspective. So our beef on dairy programs that we're looking at there, and there's been a huge amount of work there, but that's from an animal welfare perspective, which all actually falls under the whole beef sustainability story as well, by the way. It's just as critical as the Scope 3 emissions. But yeah, I just would echo Nick's comments there, particularly in terms of there's a lot of work to be done in that space. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, awesome. Hey, look, thank you very much. So thanks, Belinda, Merri, and Nick for your time tonight and presenting to us. It was really interesting. Look, there are some questions, still some questions there, but we'll come back to you directly and answer those via email if that's all right. But yeah, look, once again, thank you to our speakers, and thank you also to everyone who has attended tonight, and I hope that you've got something out of it. If you do have any other questions or queries, there are the emails up there on the screen now. Yeah, otherwise, thank you very much, and have a good night.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Thanks for coming along, everyone.